Hey Percussion Pals, my name is Oliver Molina, Chair of the Education Committee of the Percussive Art Society, and welcome to the second to last installment of this year's Fundamental Friday sessions this summer. We've had a great lineup of topics and clinicians this summer, so check them out when you have a chance. Today's topic is on snare drum embellishments, given by Dr. Caleb Pickering, Assistant Professor of Percussion at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi.
Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Caleb Pickering, Percussion Professor at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. I'm here to talk to you today about an issue that I find in a lot of students playing as, coming in as first-year college auditionees, high school all-state auditions, festival auditions, anything like that. So what is this issue? It is embellishments on snare drum. So what are embellishments? Very simply put, you have a primary note, right? A standard note. It's any grace notes or figures added to embellish that figure. So what does that include for us as percussionists? You probably know them. Flams, drags, ruffs. So what is a flam? It's just a note preceded by a single grace note. So before you hear the primary note, a much smaller grace note sounds to thicken the note and give it a little bit more weight and a little more emphasis. So let's take a listen. Here's 4 quarters followed by 4 flams. So what do we need to get a good quality flam? So we need to ask 2 questions right off the bat. One, how much space is between the grace note and the primary note, right? Because it could be very wide, where it's almost a rhythm, or it could be very tight, where it's almost a double stop. And then 2, how high is our grace note? Because if our grace note is too high, we've all been to probably a physics class or some sort of intro class where we've talked about okay, if we have 2 objects from the same height, they go down at the same velocity, they're going to hit at the same time, right? So to get a good flam, we just need to have a difference. And we don't want to play the primary note louder, right? We want to take our grace note down to widen up the sound. So grace notes exist on a spectrum of closed to open. They can be very tight, very closed, or they can be very open where they're rhythmic. So if a grace note is too close to the primary note, or if it occurs at exactly the same time, you don't get a flam, right? You don't get that flam sound, right? You're going to get more of a double stop, so the note's hitting at the same time. So here's 4 correct flams, followed by 4 that are going to be too close, and also the grace note is going to be too high. Now, if the grace note occurs too soon before the primary note, so it's wider, more open, it's going to sound like a rhythm, like a dotted 8/16, like 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, something like that. So here's 4 good flams, followed by 4 that are too open. Now, there can be some situations and personal preference where you want a flam to be more open or more closed. So, for example, like when I'm playing a drum set gig, especially rock or funk or something a little bit louder, I often make my flams pretty open because I want that really just fat drum set sound. But in general concert playing, and even the marching arts too, we want a much tighter flam overall. So now the second question to address is our grace note low enough to get a successful flam? So it's really important to make sure that your grace note hand stays down, right? 9 times out of 10 when I'm working with, say, a freshman student coming in first year of college, a high school student, all-state, any of that, typically their flam grace notes are just too high, and it's causing them to get double stops, bad placement, bad flams, just in general. So it's really important that our grace note stays low. So I'm going to play some flams with grace note nice and low where it should be, and then over time I'm just going to bring it up. So that grace note's going to rise up to meet the height of this other stick, and you're going to hear it go from a flam to very close to a double stop. And the double stop is not what we want. So something I do to help with this and help my students with this is I'll take a music stand, or in this case, just a cymbal stand with the arm boomed out at a 90-degree angle. And all I'm going to do is create a ceiling for my grace note. And this isn't something we'll put into actual practice within musical figures, because we need our left hand to come up eventually, or our grace note hand to come up eventually. But just so you can feel the space of what a good grace note is, and it's very low. It's much lower than a lot of younger students think it is. I'll just make a ceiling. Typically, I'll go just above a hand's width, a couple of inches, because you do need a little bit of extra room just for the stick to bounce as it needs to. But a lot of the time, students will come in and they start hearing that on the upswing, and then they realize, wow, my grace notes are staying quite high. So to get a good flam, we don't need a grace note that's that heavy. So here's some flams with sticks, right? Finger. Obviously it's not as full because my hand's not as heavy as stick, or my finger's not as heavy as the stick, but it still fattens up the sound a little bit. So our grace note's nice and low. So now that we've got our grace notes under control, we're keeping them nice and low, our spacing's correct, let's try to do some flams in a more musical context. So let's try some flam accents. So I chose flam accents just because that seems to be the flam rudiment that most people struggle with in my experience. But you can break it down real simply. Just isolate parts of the rudiment, right? Start with the single flam. Once you feel comfortable, add the next partial, or the third partial after that. Because if you play 1, lead 2, lead 3, lead 4, lead 1, it's just swung flam taps, right? And then if we want to put a flam accent into it, we'll just throw that extra partial in. For the sake of time, I'll move on, but any flam rudiment, or any rudiment in general, you can just break down the figure by just isolating each part of it. And in fact, we'll do that next with hand separation. So one thing I do, a lot of us do in the percussion community, is we have to break down the hand patterns so we have that composite rhythm on both hands and we know what it sounds like and feels like, and we can isolate it. So those flam accents we had just then, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to leave one hand on the drum, one on the rim. You could use another drum, a practice pad, anything like that. But we'll be able to hear what the right hand is doing. So now we know that figure 1, lead 2, lead 3, lead 4, lead. And now we know we need to do a downstroke on the first one, and then the rest stay nice and low, except for that last one. Has to come back up to prepare us for the next accented flam. If we take the left hand, we can do the exact same thing. And of course, we can do this with not just embellishments, but anything, we'll take paradiddles. Now we know it's down, tap, tap, up. We can break down anything if we isolate the hands. And like I mentioned, flams are that embellishment that I just find my students and incoming students just really struggle with. Even judging all state etudes for various states, flams and embellishments are always the one that gets people, but especially flams within musical context. So I really encourage you, anytime you have a flam in music, just take a few minutes, sit down, break down the passage, isolate the hands, double check your grace notes are nice and low, and you'll have success. So up next are drags. So what's a drag? Just like a flam is one grace note leading to a primary note, a drag is 2 grace notes leading to a primary note. So since a drag is just 2 grace notes leading to the primary, personally, I kind of think of it as a flam that's diddled. And of course, since before when we were working on flams, we have to keep low grace notes and spacing to the primary note, the only added addition we have to worry about now is the spacing of those 2 doubles that lead to the primary note, right? If they're too wide, we might get a rhythm like end of 1, end of 2, end of 3. And if they're too closed, it might sound like a buzz, and we might not be able to hear both notes. Here's a couple of isolated drags, just so you can hear them. So the placement of the drag double is a little bit personal and subjective and situational. But one thing that it is not is it's not a buzz. You know, that's really an easy fix that I see people throw around sometimes. If a student can't get the drag, they'll just say buzz it. But it's not a flam with a buzz on it. It's two notes. We need to hear two grace notes that lead to the primary. Making it a buzz is just not what's on the page, so we want to make sure we hear two notes. And as long as our flam placement is good, we can almost think of this as just, again, a flam with a diddle on it. If we have good flam placement, good diddle control, low grace note, we have success. So embellishments and rolls, they exist on this spectrum of space between, very open and very tight, very closed. And where the good sound is, it's somewhere in the middle. And again, like I said, it can be personal preference and a bit situational. In my opinion, if you can't tell if it's a rhythm or an embellishment, it's too open. And if you can't tell if it's an embellishment like a drag or a buzzed flam, it's too tight. If it sounds like a buzz, it's too closed. And if it sounds like a rhythm, it's too open. We want to hear both notes, but not rhythmically. So here's a simple exercise that I use to work on drag quality. I share this with my students and students I work with. I'm going to play a series of drags from extremely closed. I'm going to slowly open them up over time, that grace note hand, until it becomes almost tripletized. And then I'm going to slowly bring it back to the best of my ability to extremely tight again. And the drag sound I want is somewhere in the middle, leaning a little bit towards a little more closed, because I don't want it to sound like a rhythm. So for me, the drag that I want and that I'm searching for is the one where it's as close as we can get it, but still hearing two notes. I want them a little zippier and a little tighter. This can be personal preference, this can be situational. If it's something that's more of a march, we might play them a little more open, a little fatter of a sound. If we want something really short and tight, well, we might do them as almost a buzz, really staccato. Last up, but certainly not least, is our final embellishment of the day, four-stroke rough. So what is a four-stroke rough? Well, a flam, was one grace note leading to a primary. A drag is two leading to a primary. You probably guessed it. A four-stroke rough is three grace notes leading to a primary, right? 1, 2, 3. The primary is 4. So the naming convention for this can get a little bit messy. What we just referred to as a drag, 2 graces leading to a primary. Some folks and some older method books will refer to that as a rough, and they'll refer to 3 grace notes to a primary as a 4-stroke rough. Me personally, I like 2 graces to a primary, I call that a drag. 3 to a primary, I call it a rough. It just gives a little more delineation, and for me, rough, 4-stroke rough, etc., we kind of start getting into semantics, but I prefer the shorter term of drag and rough, but you will see both used in numerous places. So with a 4-stroke rough, there's a lot of sticking choices we can do. I'm going to talk about 2. It's the 2 I use, and this is the 2 a lot of folks use. You'll see other versions of it or inversions of it. I'm going to talk about one that goes right, left, right. You might see someone just flip it, left, right, left, just depending what hand they want to go off of. So to start, I'm going to talk about the alternating one that I use. Right, left, 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 right. 3 graces to a primary, 3 softer notes that swell lead into a bigger one. So for me, that sticking, the alternating, has a little bit more power, and it feels a little bit more rhythmic, right? A 4-stroke rough should not be a rhythm. We don't want to hear 1, 2, 3, da-da-da-dum. We don't want it to sound like a pickup of a sextuplet. We do want it to sound like 3 graces that are non-rhythmic. But for me, the alternating does give a little bit more power, so like the first note of a big piece or a big impact point or a loud moment, I like to use the alternating because it has a little more gusto to it. So the other sticking we're going to mention is the doubled sticking, which is a little bit more involved, but it's quite simple in concept. So I'm going to be playing a soft first right hand, then a doubled soft left hand, followed by a louder right hand release to the primary note. Just a tap, followed by a small double, leading into our main note. So you can vary this to your own preference. I've seen some folks that like to do right, right, left, right. It doesn't quite work for me. I'm not a fan of that one. But again, you just have to find the sticking that works for you. So something I like to do for soft roughs is I call it the V method. So what I do is basically I'm playing in a V shape over the head. And this is occurring over about 1 inch to 1.5 inches space, very tiny. I'm going to make it big right now just for demonstration purposes. But I like to think of the V method. So if I'm going right, left, left, right for that impact, I'm going to put my first right a little bit closer to the edge. Then I'm going to take that first left, drag the double, and then release the right hand about 1 inch closer to the center of the head. And for me, that kind of gives the illusion of going from the edge just slightly into the center. I feel like it gives me a little bit of that mini crescendo into the rough, and I just prefer that sound. So on the head, it's going to look something like this. We'll have our first note. We're going to double this left hand. First note, it's going to bounce, and then we're going to release with our right hand. I find when I do that very soft slice with the left hand, it just gives me a bit of a fuller sound, and it makes it a little bit easier for me because I'm not going to get extra bounces or any fuzz or anything like that playing at a really low dynamic. So regardless of what embellishments you are working on, it's just so important you break down these figures. And I hear just so many people come in as, first-year college student for an audition, an all-state student, a festival audition, anything like that. And they really, really often struggle with being able to just successfully and consistently play embellishments as they want. And because when we're playing a snare drum, a poor embellishment or an embellishment that doesn't come out, a popped flam, a 4-stroke rough that gets an extra beat, anything like that, is kind of the equivalent of missing a pitch on a pitched instrument. And we don't want that. So if you're a student, I just really encourage you to work on isolated embellishments, incorporate it as a part of your daily warm-up. Even just 15 minutes, 5 minutes a day even, of really zoned in, focused work on embellishments will pay off for you in the future. And lastly, I would really encourage you to check out Lee Vinson's website. Lee Vinson, Leevinson. He has some amazing warm-ups on there. I have been using his soft 4-stroke rough exercise and his 20-minute Kiji exercise for the better part of a decade. They're very simple, they get to the point, and they get you better. All right, thanks for tuning in. Go practice and keep your grace notes down.